your narrator. This is Colin. He's going to be our gaffer today. If you guys have any questions, obviously we're live streaming right now, so you can go ahead and type them in the comments. We got Misha back there and he can read them to me. Really quickly, we're just going to go through all the equipment for anybody who hasn't seen a glass demonstration with us before. Sort of the heart of our studios down here. This is our furnace. This guy holds about 500 pounds of molten glass. Inside that bright glowing door, there's a big ceramic bowl called a crucible. So that's made out of a ceramic material. Ceramic actually gets much hotter than glass. So most of our equipment is made out of a mix between high fire ceramic and steel. So that's our furnace. That's rocking at 2150. Colin's doing a little bit of preheating. You want to pick up that bar?
Yeah. Sorry, I don't mean
You're fine to do the prep work. But the next thing that we're going to look at is our pipe warmer. So hot glass only sticks to hot things. So we preheat our stainless steel pipes. They glow sort of a nice cherry red, and that's how we know we're ready to gather. So all of these are made out of stainless steel, and stainless steel is a really poor conductor of heat. So you'll notice Colin and I don't wear any gloves. We sort of have to have some nice limp dexterity. Colin's picking that up, and he's going into our reheating chamber. And color bar we can work with just because our entire tank is full of colorless glass. So if we were to just work with color glass, all of the demonstrations we make would be clear. So Colin has a nice little chunk of color bar going into our reheating chamber. And you notice when Colin pulls glass out of that furnace, it sets up pretty quickly. So he's got to go in and out and in and out. And this is about at the same temperature as our furnace, that 2150 range. We have our large marver table. We'll talk about that a little bit later on. And then where Colin's going to be sitting is called our bench. You'll notice Colin has to sort of turn a lot. And our bench allows us to set our pipe on our rails, takes a little bit of the weight off. This whole process can be sort of taxing on your body. So anything that we can do to sort of alleviate any of the struggle can help out. I can take that from you.
Yep.
So we're going to do something called an overlay. And after we do it, I'll sort of show you guys what color bar looks like and talk a little bit about the process. But in order for us to make our demonstrations look like they're made out of color, we can sort of add different types of glass. And glass comes in a lot of different formulas. Today we're working with soda lime glass or soft glass. So anything with the same coefficient of expansion we can stick right onto our furnace glass. And we don't have to worry about it breaking. Whereas if we were to mix like vintage Pyrex, it's made out of borosilicate glass, that stuff will crack right off. So Colin's gonna make our starter bubble. Yeah, we're putting this on a bubble, right? Putting this on a bubble? Okay. And this just sort of allows him to have a little bit of air in there. Got that nice fresh gather. Once we start sort of adding layers on, if you don't introduce air early on, it can be a lot harder to put the bubble in later. Colin's going to show off our nice little bubble. And Colin doesn't have to blow crazy hard, especially when that glass is fresh out of the furnace. It's sort of like a balloon. If you blow really, really hard, really, really fast, it'll pop. And you make something called cellophane glass, which isn't something that we're really interested in here. Colin's going to give that a nice shape. And we want to make sure that sets up nice and cold. So Colin can physically smear our little bit of color bar all the way across our bubble. What color is this, Colin? It's pretty soft. You almost ready for me? You ready for me? So I'm gonna get this nice and hot. Bring it right over to Colin. A little too hot. Sorry. That's my bad. Now Colin gets to have fun smearing that on. Sorry. So an overlay is basically allowing us to push that color on top. So if I have to take a guess, Colin's going to pull a little bit of that over the side, different pigments, and sort of mix them in. So if Colin's working with a gold glass, we can't really just add gold in there. Everything's done with metals. So if we were working with something like a copper blue, we could throw a little bit of copper into our colorless tank, and it'll tint the whole tank that nice copper blue. Obviously, we're a public access studio, so a lot of different people are using this space. So for us to really have the most versatile options, colorless glass is the way to go, and then we can add these colored parts separately. Colin's done a nice job of covering that up. Yeah. I've heard people call that pulling your socks up, where you like cover the sides of your bubble. So you can see Colin sort of smearing that over. And he knows as long as it's covering up the part where he can see that bubble, it's not going to show up in our final piece. We can cut those off later. Or you can peel it up now. Okay. So now that Colin's got that color on, he's going to make sure it blends nice and evenly. The tough thing about color bars, we sort of have to do that preheating and sliding on top. Another way that we can work with glass is with frit. So frit is these tiny, tiny pieces that we can just pick up on the outside of the bubble. And this is stuff that you would see us use in like our workshop scenarios where we sort of have to work a little bit more quickly. And frit can make the object look like it's one color all the way through. Or I'm sorry, color bar makes the object look like it's one color all the way through, and then frit gives it more of a painterly appearance. So it's got those nice tiny chunks. So once Colin has his bubble set up, we'll take another dip on top of this. When we work in here, we can't really get all of the glass that we need at once. Obviously, if it gets too hot, it's really hard to turn. So if Colin was try to gather up enough glass for a piece all at once, it's going to be really, really hard for him to keep that on center and keep it on the pipe. Yeah, I don't know what that is. Different colors have different properties. So normally yellow is a pretty stiff color, but obviously this one's a little bit softer. It gets pretty hot pretty quickly. Whereas a stiff color, we'd have to give it a lot of heat in order to make it warm enough to be malleable. Sorry. That's my bad. So once Colin has this nice and set up, we'll take another dip on top of that. The tough thing about working with colored glass is that when you first start, you sort of can't get used to how it feels. But if Colin were to drop any of this into the furnace, it would totally tint the furnace that one color. And then everybody would be making iris yellow or whatever this is stuff all week long. And then for like 3 to 5 years, it would all have a slight iris tint. Which could be nice. Could be fun.
Could become your favorite color.
I have no idea what that color is, dude. Sorry. So now Colin's got his second dip, and you can really see the difference of where the clear glass is versus the colored glass. And as we start to inflate this, you'll be able to really have it trick your eye so it looks like it's one color all the way through. Colin's going to go in with our wooden block. And you'll notice most of our tools tight grain pattern. So there's not a lot of sap in there. So if we were to do this with something like oak, it's going to catch fire really easily. But since it has that tight grain pattern, we can waterlog them really nicely. And since they're waterlogged, it creates a steam barrier. It's called the Leidenfrost effect. It's what happens when you have like a hot pan on your stove and you throw a little bit of water on there and it dances around. That's our Leidenfrost effect. So that steam barrier is actually what's shaping the glass. If Colin were to work on that block for like a really long time, you could see it start to smoke, and eventually that wood will start to stick to his glass. Colin's going to give that a nice shape. Glass naturally, if we were to just take it out of the furnace and turn it really evenly, it would eventually turn into this shape. However, we want to work a little bit faster. So that allows us to sort of speed that process up. Colin has this nice blow hose attached to the end of him, so we can physically blow into that. Normally when you watch a demonstration, you'll see us working together much more closely, but obviously we've sort of had to make some adjustments. So Colin has this nice noodle. Okay, Colin's going to take one more dip on top of this. Right now he has enough to make maybe a small vase, maybe a small cup, but I imagine he's going to cut some of that clear off. So we got to add a little bit more glass. Now that Colin has that bubble in there, he really has to be careful with his heat. So if he lets this thing get too cold, when we go back into the furnace, it's going to crack and fall apart. But if he lets it go in too hot, the air in there can really easily condense back down on itself. And then it adds an extra little bit of challenge. Just a strip. Yeah. So Colin's going to take what we call a strip gather. And when we're going in there, it's sort of like sticking a chopstick in honey, right? We have to physically wind the material up onto the pipe. So it can be sort of hard to control how much material we're getting. So Colin can take a little bit more than he needs and then let it all fall off the pipe. And the nice thing about clear glass is that it's infinitely recyclable in here. So all of our strip off bucket we can just throw right back into the furnace and it'll melt right back up with the rest of our glass. Colin's going to go up a block size. So now he's got enough glass for his object. And now we can really start inflating. So Colin's going to make sure the heat is even throughout all of his layers, right? Because we have that internal bubble layer that we started with, then we have that layer on top. So we got to heat them all up, make them nice and homogeneous, and then we can really start to inflate and shape this object. And when we're working in here, we're going to work from the top down. So it's a little bit backwards than how you would think. So the top is the part that's closest to the pipe. So as Colin's inflating right now, what he's going to do is something called bottom weighting. Because when we're working in here, we can't really touch the object and we can't really set it on the table. So Colin's got to plan ahead a little bit. He's going to give it another block, make sure those walls are nice and set up. And this is sort of the tricky part. When you start blowing glass, you really like shoot your bubble to the tip. But when you think about an object that's designed to be used, and since glass is such a fragile material, you have to really think about how you want your bubble to be set up. So you want it to be nice and thin at the top and really thick at the bottom, because that's where it makes contact with the table. Big marver. So Colin's going to go over to our large marver. We like to say that glass is a memory. So every time Colin touches it with something, or every time he sort of moves it around in a different way, that glass is going to remember that. So this is really where he's putting in that bottom weighting. And since he's touching this glass to this really, really cold table, we like to say it has that heat memory. So when he starts to inflate, the shoulder, or the part that's closest to the pipe, is going to inflate more rapidly than the bottom. And a lot of this comes with experience. When you first start working, you sort of make cups that are really thin at the top and thin at the bottom. And then those cups break pretty quickly. But Colin's made maybe like 10,000 vases at this point. So a lot of the stuff in here comes from experience. This isn't really something that you can like study and like read a book about how to do it. You sort of just have to do it over and over again. So Colin, I think he's putting a neck in this, if I remember right. So we're gonna make sort of a pitcher or a bottle shape. So in order to put that neck in, or you know, the top of our bottle, he's gonna physically constrict down in there, and he's gonna pull it out. So he's stretching that glass out into a neck. And Colin's using his tool, a tool called the jacks, which are sort of our iconic glass blower tool. And right now he's creating a constriction line. So nothing in the museum has a pipe stuck into the end of it. So we gotta be able to get this off of the pipe. So that's what our constriction line is for, and that's sort of one of the basic things of glass blowing. You have to have a jack line. Colin's making sure that's nice and straight. When we're working in here, you know how in ceramics when you make a pot, you sort of have to center the clay at the beginning? And here we have to keep everything on center throughout the entire piece. So you would think Colin's right hand's the one that's doing the tooling, it's probably doing most of the work, but his left hand is really putting the power in with the turning and really controlling how the shape changes. I don't know what this color is, Colin. That is not yellow. Oh, maybe it is. Maybe it's iris. Yeah. It's pretty soft though. So Colin's going in with our newspaper tool. It's obviously made out of newspaper. So when we work in here, we really can't touch anything with our hands, right? And our jacks sort of, you have a limited feeling of how the glass is moving. But our newspaper is really the closest we can ever get to physically touching that material. So it's 8 to 10 sheets of newspaper folded up, and then we leave it in the bucket like our blocks so that they get nice and waterlogged. And Colin can really feel the profile of the object while he's working on it. You're gonna stretch it? So right now Colin's doing something called spot heating. So if he were to get that neck hot, remember he just did all of that work to straighten it out. So it's gonna be a lot harder to turn and a lot harder to manipulate. So Colin's gonna heat that bottom up, and since he's put that bottom weight in, he's gonna use a little bit of gravity, and that gravity is gonna pull the hot glass to the ground, and it's gonna physically elongate the sides of the glass. Colin can do that again, I'm guessing. And the entire time we're working in here, we're sort of fighting against gravity, right? Colin has to be really on top of his turning. But we can sort of use some of the simple principles of glass blowing in order to use gravity to our advantage. Colin's gonna go in with his newspaper, shape up those sides. Going for sort of a tall bottle. And objects like bottles can be a little bit more decorative. This you could put like flowers in, but when we're making things like bowls and cups, you have to be a little bit more precise with how you're making them. Just because people are going to sort of use them to drink out of, eat out of, put fruit in. And there's a lot of different ways with working with the material. When we do demonstrations in here, it really focuses on how practical glass blowing is. So a lot of the things we make are made to be used. But if you look throughout the collection, there's tons of different ways of working with the material. If we were to work with the material in sort of an artistic sense in here, it can often take a lot more time. So unless somebody wants to watch a 6-hour demo, it can be a little bit tougher. Colin's gonna give it a little bit more heat. I'm gonna grab a paddle. Sort of has a groovy lava lamp thing going on with the clear. Colin's gonna come on in with this paper.
I don't need panel yet.
Okay. You can give it a little bit of inflation. The noodle is tough. You can see him doing that little bit of a rocking move. That's him sort of straightening his bubble out a little bit. It does sort of look like a groovy bowling pin.
Super good. I'll take panel.
Okay. So now we're gonna go ahead and paddle this. And when we're doing this, it's because Colin only has two hands, right? So one hand's holding a tool, one hand's holding the pipe. So I can go in and physically change the shape of the bottom of the bottle, sort of even it out. If we were to make anything any larger, we would really have to have more people on a team. Glassblowing is very much a team sport. And you can do it by yourself, but it can be very challenging on your body. So I'm going in with this wooden paddle sort of in the nook of Colin's newspaper. And we can shape that bottom up. Colin's given it a nice little indent. A good example of this is if you've ever looked at the bottom of a wine bottle, you want to really have control over how the bottle makes contact with the table. So we're going to let that even out a little bit, and then we're going to attach our punty onto the bottom. So if we were to just break this off right now, it's going to have a really sharp top. And sure, we could cut it off later, but for us to really finish it nicely, we can stick a little bit of glass onto the bottom and flip this bad boy around and start to work on the top. You ready? Which do you want for the punty? This guy? Okay. So I gotta make Colin the right shape of punty. So it's sort of that similar Q-tip shape that we talked about before. This is where I get really quiet because I gotta focus. This is sort of a connection that's designed to fail. So if I make this too hot or too wrong shaped, Colin can just weld it onto the bottom of his pipe, and then it's really hard to get off later on. But if we don't make it stable enough, the piece can really easily fall onto the ground. You want to flash again? Okay. So I'm going to come on over. Colin's going to stick me right onto the bottom. And he's going and he's turning to make sure we're nice and on center. If we stick this punty super off center and we start to open up the bottle, it can be really, really tough to make it not totally crooked. Yeah, I can take that. I would like them, but it's not essential. So we're going to go ahead and give this a nice flash. That break-off point is sort of in a tricky spot because it was just cold enough for us to break. So we got to keep it nice and happy while also making sure our punty stays nice and on center. You can sort of hear that cold steel on cold glass sound. So now that Colin's nice and on center, we're going to heat up the front of this. This is sort of our longest reheat, right? Because you see Colin and I are up and down, up and down. You sort of only have about 15 seconds. Colin's going to get it really, really hot, just like how it was from the furnace. And when glass is really hot, it's really elastic. So if we were to get a fresh dip out of the furnace, Colin could grab one end of the pipe, I could grab the other end of the glass, and we could run all the way across the museum. And it'll keep going and going and going. We can see that neck start to move a little bit. This is the tough thing with bottles, because Colin has to really control where he's heating. So Colin can go in with his tweezers, and these are just like your tweezers at home, just big and stainless steel. And he's going to give little pinches and pulls to physically stretch that bottleneck out. Give it another heat. And Colin could keep doing this basically forever. Just by reheating and stretching out. Really, in here the limitations are like the size of our reheating chamber and how many people we have. So Colin's going in and he's putting in another constriction line. We're going to use the same principle that we used to knock this bottle off of the pipe. So he's going in, he's cooling the inside of that constriction line, cooling the outside. He's going to give it a little bit of a munch with his diamond shears. I can give it a little tap, and it comes right off. Our diamond shears are another sort of cool glass blowing tool. So when we're working in here, we're working in the round. And Colin has a pair of straight shears, which are just like regular old scissors. But you'll notice when he's cutting, he has to turn and then physically cramp down. Can't really do that with straight shears. You gotta make a bunch of tiny crimps. So then Colin's gonna go in and use his jacks, sort of at a different angle than from before. And he's gonna use them like a mold to physically open this bottle up. You want a paddle?
Yeah.
I'm gonna go on with my paddle on the lip just to make sure everything's nice and straight. Okay. Colin can go back and make sure that neck's nice and straight. I see what you mean. And here you can really see the difference in heat. The top of this bottle has a little bit more of a glow to it. Then back by our punty where you can see it's sort of cooling down. Yep. Again. Colin's gonna do a little bit of nitpicking. When we blow glass in here, you think, oh, it's handmade, you want it to have a little bit of handmade flair. But if I know Colin, he's so precise that he wants it to look machine-made almost. So he's gonna go back and make sure that neck is nice and crisp. You want a paddle? Ooh. Ooh. And you'll see Colin goes on both the inside and the outside of the bubble. So those are sort of at different heats, and they can do different things. Colin's gonna go on with his little map gas. When we go into the reheating chamber, it's a really aggressive flame from all sides. So Colin can use sort of smaller torches, and that allows him to heat very specific areas. Yeah, Sophie. What's up?
We're gonna try and soak this, and then we'll do those bits after.
Okay. Colin's gonna use a nice little tool called our Sophietta. those were invented so you could make really nice thin glasses, which are sort of a luxury item. Those are some things that are designed to break. So Colin's going in, he's blowing nice and hard. And he can go back in with his jacks and sort of straighten that out a little bit. You want like a double dip?
Yeah, double dip, carrot.
Finger?
Finger. Carrot.
How cold? How hot? Okay.
A little hotter.
But not molten? So we're gonna add on something called a bit. So the nice thing about hot glass is that it fuses to hot glass really well. So we don't really have to do any prep work. I can go over to our furnace, I'm gonna gather up a little bit of glass, and Colin can stick it right on. So I'm gonna get a little bit of glass. I'm taking what's called a double dip, which is something you hear pretty commonly about from us. So I just get this nice little core set up, and that sort of gives me a foundation to gather more glass on top of. You want 2 of these, Colin, or just 1? Okay. No problem. So I'm gonna give this a nice marver. Do you want like it a little pointy at the end, Colin? Sort of like that? Okay. Colin's gonna take a nice flash. And when I talk about him flashing, it's sort of those quick heats. Those are sort of maintenance heats. If we ever let this material get too cold, it can really easily fall off onto the ground. Even with the vibration from him touching it from the pipe to the bench. Like a punny? Okay. I think this is good. Not crazy hot. Straight up and down? Oh, okay. You said like a punny. Colin's got that nice bit attached. Just gonna give it a quick heat. And since that glass was so hot, it's got a lot more of a heat difference than the bottle. So Colin can stay in the reheating chamber for a little bit, and that'll absorb a little bit more heat. Colin's gonna go in with his straight shears. He's gonna physically cut that glass apart. These shears aren't like crazy sharp or anything. It's physically just cooling down that selection of glass until it breaks apart. And then Colin, since it's nice and hot, can still manipulate it. Give it a nice little curl. A little too cold. He can go back in. This is a nice time to have those torches. So there's even a hotter torch that we call the hot torch that Colin could use and really spot heat that bit and then change it up. This is sort of the traditional way. Back in the Roman times, they didn't have any torches, so they had to work fast. Colin can give it that nice curl. And he doesn't want to stick the cut part right back onto the bottle because it won't actually fuse since that glass is so cold. You'll see him flip it around and stick it down on there. You ready for another one? So we're gonna put another one on the other side while Colin cleans that up. Handles can be really tricky because since they're so thin and so far away from the center bubble, they can cool down too quickly and really easily crack and break. I'm gonna try to make sure I get Colin a similar amount of glass. That's the tough thing about handles. If I bring Colin a much larger bit, the other handle will be much larger and won't match. Do you need a flash again? Okay. I'm gonna get this nice and warm, and we'll do the same thing we did before. And this is where it gets tricky to sort of replicate what we've just done. So Colin's gonna stick it on. He's gonna eyeball sort of the same amount of glass he took last time. Then he's gonna cut me right off. Then he can go back into our reheating chamber. And this is where it can get really, really tricky, because those handles that we put on before can heat up much quicker. So Colin's got to get his nice little new fresh bit hot enough while making sure those handles don't get too hot. If the handles get too hot, they sort of start to drift a little bit. And once hot glass sticks back onto itself, you sort of have to cut it off, and then it never looks quite right. Colin's giving it a good stretch, sticking it back down. Just gonna give it another heat. This is where it gets really tricky. They look good. This is fun. You've got like a funky bottle and then like very traditional Venetian handles on the side. The true American glass blowing. Colin can sort of keep stretching that. And even though the glass starts to set up and look clear and colorless, it really still is quite hot. So now that Colin's got those nice and stuck down. Oh, we're gonna clean up the neck a little bit. That's all right. Colin can go back in with his jacks. If that neck gets too hot, do you want to paddle? No. Okay. If those bits get that neck too hot, they can actually create an indent inside of the neck, and that sort of limits usability. So Colin's letting that set up, making sure that's nice and even, doing any sort of last minute finishing touches. It sort of looks like a butterfly. Ready? So now we're gonna get ready to take this piece off. So this glass is somewhere, it's over 1,000, but not by too much. But if we were to just leave it out in the room temperature air, that's gonna be enough to physically crack and break it. So we're gonna let it cool down slowly through a process called annealing. And you can be familiar with this in working with metal. This just cools it down so that it's nice and stable. Because right now that glass has a lot of stress in it from being really hot in one area, really cold in another. So I'm gonna put on my cool outfit so that way I can physically grab this glass. I'm gonna put a little bit of heat on these gloves. You want to take it off on the knockoff, Colin? Yeah. Okay. Even since my gloves have been sitting at room temperature, they're already cold enough that if I go to grab this with like really cold gloves, it can shoot a crack right up the side of the bottle. Good? Yeah. So now that Colin's nice and flashed down, we can come on over to our knockoff table. And remember that punty connection is that connection that's designed to fail. So it's a little bit similar to our jack line. So Colin's got his nice little squirty water bottle. He's gonna go all the way up to where that punty makes contact with the bottom of the piece. Give it a little bit of water. Then he can give it a nice tap. And it'll come right off. Then Colin has that nice hot torch that we talked about earlier. And he can melt in that punty mark because that glass was just cold enough for us to break. So it is technically a little bit sharp. We could finish it off later separately, but that's going to take a little bit more time. Okay. I can do that. That one's gonna go in with our nice brass CMA stamp. That's how you know something's made here. It's either signed or has this nice stamp. I'm gonna pick it on up. And we're gonna load it away in our annealing oven. Nice. So that in there is sitting at about 900 degrees. It's at 918. So the thickest part of that object is those handles, right? So they're not very thick. So for larger objects, we would have to anneal much cooler because we want that glass to cool down nice and evenly. If we let it cool down too fast, it's gonna crack and break really quickly. The nice thing about being in the modern era is that we have this computerized annealing. Traditionally, what the Romans would have done is they would have buried their glass next to the reheating chamber and hoped that it survived. So if you guys have any questions, you can comment them in the comments and then Misha can read them to me. Otherwise, the galleries are open. We're open Wednesday through Sunday. The hours vary a little bit from normal. We'd also like to thank our demo sponsors, Owens, Illinois. Are there any questions, Misha? Cool, thanks guys. We'll be back on Sunday at 2 o'clock. We're doing these Sunday, Wednesday, and Friday. So thanks for watching.